everybody. On 2 o'clock, so we'll resume and continue. We've got as far as issue 2, distribution and development. I think what we'll find is actually probably discussed and answered quite a lot of these questions. So again, as I said before, is each thing I'm skipping over questions, that's just because I don't have any questions or further questions on those particular issues. But please do feel free to make any points of representations as we go through. So again, really, question 1 was about the distribution and development as the council sorts direct housing growth towards settlements. Based on their scoring in settlement role and function study, I think we've probably answered that one this morning. Again, unless anybody
I want to take you to uncharted territory, which is the rural east. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been much discussion about that, in particular the housing provision in relation to Cranbrook and Hawkins, the main towns. It'll go between question 1 and 2, if you allow me to elaborate. Our concerns there primarily are to do with compliance with the framework, paragraph 78 and 79, sustainable development in rural areas, and paragraph 84, promoting a prosperous rural economy. And also, the second point is the very strong imbalance between West and East. And the towns of Hawkhurst and Cranbrook ranking 3 and 4 after Tunbridge Wells and Paddockwood in the second paragraph. So they are of themselves important towns, but they're also dealing with the rural hinterland. And that's a very important consideration. If I can just take you just to illustrate this to the council's hearing statement on this, there's a table there, so their paragraph 11, table 1, which sets out the percentage of development which is proposed for each settlement group. And it says that they haven't done that before, which is surprising, but this was the first time they've actually put those figures in. Now, they need some disaggregation because at Group A, which is Royal Tunbridge Wells, the total number of dwellings in the group 3459, that is primarily history, because those are existing commitments and allocations. The current figure, or the future figure from the submission plan is 1476. So that is in fact only 15.7%. So in column 4, 425.7, looking to the future, say 15.7. And then in Group B, that is significantly affected by Paddockwood. So of that 45%, 35.8 is Paddockwood. And if you take out Paddockwood and Southborough, you're left with roughly 9% going to Cranbrook and Hawkhurst. So that shows that there's a very, very strong percentage going to the western part of the borough. And if you look at Rusthall and Penry, again, those are in effect in the western part of the borough, and they're very close to Paddockwood. And then D, we've got 5.2%. Most of those are in the same area. We've got almost the same going to categories C and D, as you have got into the rural towns and villages. Taking that to that was including commitments. If you then go to what the submission plan is proposing, we've got only in Group B something around 6.8% going there, whereas in group C and D, you've got a combined total of 9%. So there's 2 points here. One is east-west, and the other is in terms of settlement hierarchy. You've got an imbalance against Hawkhurst and Cranbrook. So I'm saying so that's not a proportionate or sustainable distribution. And it doesn't provide for the growth of the main towns that serve the rural eastern part of the borough. And that's my point about the framework, that those towns are important, they need to grow. For Hawkhurst, and I think this makes the point very clearly, there's 161 dwellings proposed. 70 of those have recently been granted consent on appeal on one side and will be developed shortly, which leaves about 80 odd houses to be found over the plan period, which in terms of the main town of Hawkhurst just isn't enough to maintain the infrastructure. So we will be addressing you in relation to the medical centre in Hawkhurst, which is an allocation. That will come in a site specific later on. But the point about that is only delivered if the adjoining residential proposal comes with it. So there is a point, a very clear point there, that a lot of infrastructure needed by these main towns, and similar with Cranbrook, will only come with more growth. And there is no substantive, and I always hate absolutes because they're invariably wrong, but there's no substantive growth for either of those settlements. That compares with the Reg 18 version. Reg 18 version had substantial allocations at both Hawkhurst and Cranbrook. Again, just to show the difference, in the Reg 18 at Hawkhurst, there were 668 dwellings proposed. The current plan is 165. And the Sheila showed potential on sustainable sites for 818. So that the capacity there is for growth. The question is for the council, why is that? Why wasn't it about to change? They will say that it's because both settlements lie in the AONB. The point is that they lay in the AONB at Reg 18 and they equally lie in the AONB now, and they were assessed by the Hankinson Duckett Associates landscape assessment, which suggested that not only were they potentially acceptable with mitigation within AONB, but there were also positives to be gained from that as well. So there is no, they'll also refer to a highway resource, crossroads to Hawkhurst, and also to airport. But recent appeals have shown that neither of those are reasons for avoiding development. Consents have been granted on that. So it's really a plea for a better east-west distribution and support for the rural economy. Thanks.
Let's come back on any of those points. Again, strategic level, really, like getting more into detail of any slides that are.
Yes, sir, thank you. I think before if there are any local residents here, then I'll just quickly say that Hawkhurst is regarded as a village, not a town. But it is a rural service centre, and it is, it's scored after Southborough, Cranbrook and Paddock Wood as the highest order settlement after Tunbridge Wells, of course. So, it is got a good range of services, absolutely. We did, in fact, some of the information Mr. Hoff gave is actually, we acknowledge, and it's set out in the council's hearing statement in paragraph 13, the fact that Paddock Wood contributes substantially to that. There are considerable variations, which perhaps goes to the council's original concern about the hierarchy. Leaving that aside, that looks at development across the whole planned period. all development in terms of the allocations. I feel Cranbrook has approximately 400 dwellings there, proposed in allocations. Hawkhurst 160 to 170 is a fair number in an AONB context. And indeed, Mr. Hoff's right, we did actually consult on more previously at the draft plan stage. It was a high number, and obviously in terms of both cumulative impact and the impact of individual sites, that came down. That was primarily due to the actual landscape and visual impact assessments that Mr. Hoff referred to were done after the draft plan stage. They informed the pre-submission plan. So, that was a response to that and other landscape assessments, and indeed, highway concerns as well. So, those factors have been considered, and I would still say that obviously, it's also right, there has been a scheme accepted on appeal, which is a proposed allocation in the plan, albeit again, there was a lot of AONB concern, but that one we felt was in essence the right side of the line, and that's been endorsed by the inspector at that planning application inquiry. So, I think we feel that an appropriate amount has been provided for, and we have looked at not only those sites that were put forward at the draft plan stage, but also the emission sites as well, and they're all dealt with and considered through the Sheila.
I'll just come back quickly on those points. The Hankins and Duckett landscape appraisal did the opposite of what has just been said. It confirmed that most of the sites within this part of the road could come forward, and it gave a very precise description of what could come forward. The highway issue on the crossroads was addressed by proposals to improve putting mover into the traffic lights. So that is a historic question now. And in terms of the reassessment, if you like, of looking at these areas, the Sheila sites were changed mysteriously, shall we say, in that the sites we're promoting and others were in the original Sheilas acceptable, suitable and available. They then came forward as allocations in the proposed allocations in the Reg 18. There was no change of circumstances, they then disappeared. And there is no reasoning that you will find in the plan other than the Hankins and Duckett Associates landscape report, which will support that. That report does not say what plans the same. So I'd ask you to read that with particular reference to Cranbrook and Hawkhurst, and you'll see that it is, if anything, supportive of the Reg 18 position rather than against it.
Sorry, sir, can I just come back briefly? I've realised Mr. Hoff's talking about one specific site now. I was talking about generally across Cranbrook and Hawkhurst. In relation to one specific site, he's right. I think there was a site which they did look at as part of the preparation of the pre-submission plan, but if you want to.
Yeah, so we commissioned Hankins and Duckett's Associates to carry out landscape and visual impact assessments. We heard these some statements. As a result of engagement with Natural England following Reg 18, and that was including any sort of sites that were considered major proposed at Reg 18. And a number of those sites were dropped either on the basis of the LDIA work or for other reasons, both in Hawkhurst and in Cranbrook. And so it was one piece of evidence that the council does rely upon. It is robust, and we're confident in the results it provides, but it is only one piece of evidence. Obviously, you have to take into account other evidence, particularly in relation to transport, but also cumulative effects in an area such as Hawkhurst, and Cranbrook, which have already seen development either through appeal or through the south, and continue to deliver housing for those sites, for those settlements.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, sir. Just briefly, because it is in my written representations, but the council in their written representations in response to your question say that the settlement role and function study has had a significant influence in terms of the distribution of development, and they make other comments that give weight to the importance of the settlement role and function study. But I'd just like you to cross-reference table 5 of the study, settlement role and function study, and table 4 of the submission road and local plan. Just by way of an example, table 5 of the study scores and ranks all the settlements. Table 4 of the local plan sets out the housing allocations, and again, by way of an example, Southwark settlement at the top of the table 5 is allocated 42 new dwellings, and Horsenden, ranked 12th in the scoring table, is allocated 240 new dwellings. And there are other inconsistencies in the table which I would ask you to look at outside of this discussion. But it seems to me that the answer to the question is no, the council don't appear to have sought to direct housing growth towards settlements based on their scoring in the settlement role and function study. If there is another means by which they've done that, then it doesn't appear to be clear. I think it goes back to the points that were made previously by myself and others in previous hearing sessions about where the balance and the assumptions lie, where can they be seen, and what justification and support behind those. So I'll leave the points at that. As I say, it's in my representations.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hayes?
Thank you, sir. We also make those points in terms of mismatch between what they said in the settlement role function study and where the housing is located or proposed for the allocation plan. I just wanted to point out that Hawkhurst and Cranbrook are both, for the most part, sort of flood risk free. So, and I was looking through the sheet-off sites as well. It's not really flagged up in there in terms of flood risk, so they're mostly within flood zone 1. So if a sequential test had been applied, then it could have revealed sites that were in or around Hawkhurst and Cranbrook, but that wasn't updated, so we don't have that evidence for it.
Okay, so leads on to sort of the next question really, which is about, and this is ultimately what it all leads into, is paragraph 105 of the framework states a significant development should be focused on locations which are or can be made sustainable through limiting the need to travel and often genuine choice of transport modes. We've also talked about, the framework talks about supplying new homes to be best achieved through applying for larger scale development, such as new settlements or significant extensions to towns and villages. And we talked quite a bit about Paddock Wood and the reasons behind that. In terms of the new settlement that should be envisaged there, a lot of the representations and a lot of the, when we come on to talk about the detail of the site, I imagine we'll be discussing a lot about the transport and accessibility of that site. Bear in mind that the site isn't adjacent to an existing settlement, it's a freestanding settlement. Has the council's position always been then that this is a case that it could be made to be a sustainable settlement? Was that the sort of the justification for this all along? Or is it the council's view that actually it's in a sustainable location and it sort of ticks those boxes. What's the council's position?
So in terms of its position relative to higher order services, we discussed this at, I think, one of the earlier hearing sessions as compared to some of the other locations. There are clear transport links east to west to settlements that provide those higher order services, particularly Tunbridge to the west in relatively short distance, with the ability for both cycling, walking, particularly cycling and public transport links to those higher services. And then, so in terms of the ability for the settlement to be sustainable in its own right, to internalise trips, some trips, and to provide for particular services within it. It's absolutely considered that Chudley, at the scale of it, is in such a size that it could provide those services. Paragraph 25 details how an attractive, accessible movement framework can be located and proposed there, how that can tie into those wider transport links that I set out to the higher order services. There is the ability, in particular, to provide the secondary school there, which is a key element in terms of keeping or preventing trips from Chudley to elsewhere. Again, we've outlined its proximity to Paddockwood, which also has other services, and both are on mainline railway. Both Tunbridge and Paddockwood are on the mainline railway. And so I think the recognition of this has been through Kent County Council, who have accepted that there'll be a lower trip generation from Chudley as set out in the statement of government.
So, I think maybe time to go into detail, but what's actually envisaged with the proposal? Yesterday we talked about employment, and we talked about employment allocations of Paddockwood. But in terms of the Chudley village settlement, then what's envisaged, what's proposed to? Clearly, people would have to travel to Tunbridge Wells or Tunbridge or higher order settlements or some things. But in terms of the general day-to-day, so you talked about the school, but what about sort of employment opportunities, secondary higher education, these sort of things? What's envisaged there?
Sorry, yep.
So we've got the obviously 6 elementary secondary school, 6 elementary secondary school, and also a 3 elementary primary school. That's stipulated in the plan. It is set out, as we discussed yesterday, sort of a main village centre, and we have stipulated where we expect to be provided there. So a range of shops, services, and employment uses of an appropriate scale, which is inserted into the policy. To include community and leisure facilities. So, and we have sought not to prescribe in too much detail what will be there as a result of the conversations, the evidence base before us, because we need to allow a flexible enough framework for planning applications to come forward. But we've stipulated the type of uses that we'd expect to see, and the fact that it needs to encourage the sort of internalisation of trips and create a new place and refer to the Grand Central principles. I know it's something we're going to come on to on the Chudley Village Day itself. The Hadlow Estate delivery strategy, which was submitted at Reg 19 stage by the Hadlow Estate, sets out how they envisage that to come forward. Now that's saying it's 10,000 square metres of sort of commercial and employment floor space, and obviously commercial now, a broad range of uses such as shops, cafes, day-to-day services, but it's intended to create the community uses to enable the residents of Chudley Village to access those services on the site. The other thing that has been identified through discussions with the clinical commissioning group is that it would likely provide a health centre as well. This has evolved through discussions on the local plan, because at the outset of the local plan process, the clinical commissioning group considered that perhaps all the health needs stemming from the strategic site should go towards the village, because Chudley Village in itself may not have the catchment to support a standalone health practice. However, through conversations with the Hadlow Estate and further consideration, they all agreed that potentially a satellite GP service from Tunbridge, an existing Tunbridge practice, could be provided, and the infrastructure framework that is part of core document 3.66 has an assumption of, funding going through the Chudley Village development towards primary healthcare that could either be provided on its own site or at Paddock Wood. So it is expected that that will be provided at Chudley, but isn't in the policy for the reasons that I explained.
And just to come back to the transport links, particularly to Tunbridge, but to Paddock Wood as well, routes, offline cycling and walking routes into Tunbridge have been identified. A route for bus provision from Paddock Wood through Chudley and then through Tunbridge on a route which bypasses the areas of Tunbridge which have higher levels of car use at the peak times, has also been identified with Kent County Council, which again demonstrates that combination of a site assessment which is large enough to internalise some trips, and then for other trips associated with higher order services, for there to be the ability to provide active travel links to those higher services.
So, in summary, like you're saying, it's a bit of both really. It's located where it could be, council's view, so accessible to these higher order settlements, but also there'll be this design approach for day-to-day needs being met within that development. So would you say then that does fall with paragraph 105 of the framework, which says significant development in locations which are, or in this case, can be made sustainable? Is that the sort of council position on that? Okay, so you start at the top of the table with the two going.
I've got real difficulty trying to reconcile in my mind that this Chudley will be a sustainable location. Really struggling with that. And the reliance on access to higher order assessments. So, for instance, if I live in one of, I think it's 2,000 houses being proposed, where do I go to the optician? The dentist, the hairdressers, I've heard what you said about the GP surgery, the nursery school. Is a settlement of 2,000 big enough to provide those day-to-day services? And if it's not, how do I get there? So how far is it on the footpath or the cycleway, if I lived in Chudley, to cycle to Tunbridge? The distance in miles, or perhaps even the distance in time, would tell me. How do I get to an appointment where I need to look presentable, and I've got rain on my walk, or I'm coming back from a connection in London and I want to cycle my way home? Are those ways going to be lit? Am I going to feel safe? I struggle as well with, again, we'll go into this more on the matter 6 things. Are 2,000 dwellings enough to generate the funding for secondary school and free-form intake primary school? Or is it being provided because schools are at capacity locally, so actually you'll get in-commuting to Chudley for children who are already being educated somewhere else? And in terms of bus services, I've had a little bit of dealings with Otterpool Park at Folkestone High for 10,000 dwellings. They seem to be struggling to get agreement for bus service, but they're actually going to be able to run a service that is going to be regular, that will set the pattern and the habit of not using your car to get everywhere. You know, where is the shop, fish and chips, the pub, whatever it is you consider to be necessary for day-to-day services. I'm sure it would be a lovely place to live if you were just leisure cycling around or walking to go and see your neighbour. I would really query, how far is it to Paddock Wood on the bus or by foot? How far is it to Tunbridge Wells? Tunbridge, the nearest settlement, by bus or foot?
Thank you, sir. I think the answer to your question will be addressed when more detailed issues are discussed under matter 6. All I would say at this stage is, I give one in relation to Para 105. At the moment, that site is not in a sustainable location, and therefore, for it to be an acceptable proposal, and I believe, given the location of the site, I believe it's a pretty high bar to get to the conclusion that it will be made sustainable, partly for some of the reasons you've just heard, and I'm sure further down the corridor towards you, you're going to hear either this afternoon or under matter 6. And then that begs the question, just going back to the two previous questions you posed, whether, having regard to 105 and the distribution of development, whether a sufficient proportion of allocations, and that was the question you raised in relation to question 2, are being focused on the more higher order settlements. So I don't think at 15.7% that will come as they are. But the devil will be in the detail under matter 6.
Thank you, sir. It will come as no surprise to you that we at Safe Cape say that the garden settlement proposal at Cheveley Village cannot be made sustainable. I mean, repeat the obvious, it's obviously not in a sustainable location at the moment, not need to dwell on that. Mr. Bourne's summary of what the answer to your question, question 3, was to refer to para 25 of the position statement of the council. That, with respect, entirely glosses over the significant levels of infrastructure that need to be implemented in order to make this garden settlement sustainable. We as other speakers in turn, we do not at this stage intend to go into the full detail of what we set out in matter 6, where, for example, we set out in respect of, say, the B2017 secondary road into Tunbridge Wells, the considerable difficulties involved in the improvement to that road, for example. It's physically unsuitable to accommodate vehicles greater than 7.5 tonnes at the moment, and you'll see that. So when you drive around, have a look at the signs, you can see how unsuitable that secondary road is at the moment. So that is only one example of a number of improvements that need to be made to make this, or to attempt to make this location or this proposed garden settlement sustainable. Another significant elephant in the room, which Mr. Bourne's entirely glossed over, is the improvements to the bypass to Coles Hill. That's going to come in at a cost of at least 20 million. We have, and there are a number of other improvements, and we know this all from the infrastructure delivery statement. So the idea that, infrastructure delivery schedule, the idea that this can just be, the idea that this settlement could be made sustainable is based on pure aspiration and hope, and there is considerable uncertainty, not least because of the significant infrastructure that's required, that it will be made sustainable. And we'll be exploring this in matter 6, but just referring to the cycle routes and the pedestrian access into Tunbridge, as has already been set out by CPRE, is only half the story. I mean, it is fanciful to suggest that people can just cycle in and walk in to the train station at Tunbridge. People will be getting on their car, going down B2017. And that leads to my final point, which is a point about policy at this stage, because we don't want to get into all the detail. The paragraph you referred to says paragraph 105, but of course, that needs to be read with, in light of the following paragraph of the NPPF, paragraph 106, 106B. And that says planning policies should be prepared with the active involvement of local highways authority, other transport infrastructure providers and operators, and neighbouring councils. Now, the significant elephant in the room that emerged in the duty to cooperate session is, of course, Tunbridge and Morling Borough Council have, and as far as we're aware, still do, have serious concerns in relation to the transport impact of this proposal, and therefore its sustainability credentials. So it's no use, the constant refrain to Kent County Council and the Highways Authority isn't a sufficient answer to the real question, which is the neighbouring authority, and the authority, frankly, that's going to be most affected, or at least whose residents are going to be most affected by the transport impacts of this proposal, isn't even here today to assist you or to endorse anything that's said by by Tunbridge Wells Borough Council in support of their assertion that this can be made sustainable. We haven't seen Tunbridge and Morling Borough Council's Matter 6 statements. I don't know if you have, sir. But as I say, their serious concerns have not been addressed as far as we're concerned. We've seen no withdrawal of that point. And that alone should suggest that the idea that this is a location that can be made sustainable is quite frankly incredible at this stage. That's all I want to say at the moment. So I appreciate you don't want me to go to Matter 6, so I'm going to pull my punches at this stage. But there is an awful lot more we're going to say, but we'll reserve our position on that until Matter 6.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. I support and endorse pretty much all the comments that have been made just now in terms of the sustainability or not, as the case may be, of the allocation. In particular, the comments about walking and cycling. It's approximately, I think, 3 miles from Jubilee into the centre of Tunbridge, which is a stiff walk for most people, I would have thought, notwithstanding issues about whether it's lit, safe, and appropriate to walk across country to collect shopping or go to the doctors or opticians or anything like that. I've made reference to some of these in my written representations, but the points I would like to highlight, your question is specifically aimed at making the development sustainable by limiting the need to travel and offering a genuine choice of transport modes. And I think what you've heard so far is that there isn't a genuine choice of transport modes being offered. There are choices being offered, but the issue is whether they are genuine and practical and sustainable or not. But the point I want to highlight is that on map 32 in the plan, the Jubilee Village plan, there is a site which is crosshatched and highlighted as a potential site for a railway station. And the railway line slices right through the middle of the village allocation. There is no requirement or text in the wording of the policy itself which requires anybody to do anything about providing a railway station, either through engagement with the rail companies or securing infrastructure contributions or anything of that sort. There's nothing explicit or specific in relation to that, which I'm not sure whether that's an omission by error or there's other reason behind it, but I would have thought that would be an obvious way of offering a genuine choice of transport modes, particularly to get people out of the car into a train from which you can access both Tunbridge Wells and Tunbridge and all places beyond. So I won't add any more to what's already been said.
So I think where we're going with this, I think, is that actually the council's taken this strategic decision, this high level of the location of this proposed new settlement, but actually the answer as to whether or not the strategy is an appropriate one and falls with the sort of thrust of MPPF 105 is probably a question that's actually answered after we've had all the hearings, once we actually understand, can these routes be delivered? What are these routes being like? Are they realistically going to be used? Are there real genuine transport opportunities? Can the mix of uses that we've talked about realistically be provided with that scale of development? Is it going to be viable? Those questions, I think, actually probably answer the bigger question about whether or not this is a new settlement which MPPF 105 is or can be made sustainable. So it logically follows into all these questions and unraveling it all, especially around, I think, the viability of the type of mixed uses. And we'll come on to discuss, and this applies to both Tudor and Paddock Wood. I think I have some questions about what exactly is it that these developments are going to be provided to deliver. And I think that's as a sort of marker for those days is from looking at the plan. I do have some questions about what exactly the council is requiring these developers to deliver. I think that question applies equally to Tudor Village as it does to Paddock Wood as well.
Yes. I think your analysis is absolutely right, so I would say so. There are generic questions which allocations such as these are tracked wherever they are. There are also site-specific and locational issues which need to be addressed specifically, as well as identifying the mechanism by which and at what time various components of the infrastructure are to be provided in order to support the community. And we anticipate that those matters will be discussed in some detail.
I think so, and I think only at the end of those discussions and sort of deliberations can I ask my own question about whether it does, at a strategic level, accord with what the framework's trying to sort of direct plan makers to do around. It's saying yes, a plan for new settlements, potential to existing ones, but within sort of remit of sustainable development. Mr. Huffles,
just two short points. First one, to help you in that deliberation later on, some personal knowledge, because I live in East Beckham, so I deal with this. The first thing is the Tunbridge Wells is a major sphere of influence and draw to this area. For various reasons, be it employment, education, retail, leisure, entertainment. So a lot of people move from this area to Tunbridge Wells. You would not use the railway to go to Tunbridge Wells because you would have to change at Tonbridge from Paddock Wood. And to sort that out wouldn't happen. So people presently drive from this area into Tunbridge Wells. That then leads to the Pembury Road approach as one of the main approaches to the town as being the most congested at peak hours, even now. It will take you best part of 20 minutes between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning to get from Pembury into Tunbridge Wells. It's absolutely stationary. So the congestion is something that you'll have to look at in terms of any road improvements and funneling more traffic into that approach. It doesn't just stop in getting you up Colts Hill. it's got to go all the way into Flemish Wales. The second point, which is on my list first, the eastern part is a rural part, and if there is to be any choice there, there's no real rail service there, it's primarily buses. If there is no growth, no significant substantive growth at Cranbrook and forecast, then the already declining bus services will decline more. So part of the growth strategy, which because of their level in the second hierarchy should be applied to them, would also be available to improve the sustainable transport option buses.
Would you want to have anything further? I think my summary probably is where we need to go with it. Just want to see some of the details as we go forward. Some next questions about how it would. I didn't have anything further to add on question 4. Oh, sorry, Jennifer. Yeah.
I'd just like to comment that in this talk about what's sustainable, there seems to be a reference to a common resident who we're creating the housing for. Whereas I believe there's a wide variety of residents. And so what one person says is vital to them. And they wouldn't be going somewhere which didn't offer this service. Other people would be more than happy not to have. And with the sort of changing life patterns, people working from home, people shopping online, people perhaps moving to a small electric car, there will be people, I'm sure, who would be very happy to live somewhere like Jubilee or in the east of the borough. And to close it all off because that 50% of the average person may not want it would be a mistake. You have to cater for the variety of customers, and it would be for the developer who's allowed to provide things which would attract people to his site. And he wouldn't want to build a site that wasn't really attractive to customers. So I think too much is made of individual requirements. The question whether the package would attract a sufficient percentage of the population. I mean, there's going to be 16,000 houses built over the plan, and you've got something like 10% of that at some site like Jubilee or others. I'm not getting out of the case too. But are good 10% of the population actually be attracted by the sort of situations that would exist there, even though it wouldn't suit maybe the small children? There isn't a school available and so on. But there's a lot of people who I think would like perhaps be out of town in the country, relatively quiet. They could manage for their shopping, they could manage for their work. So I don't think that's a conclusive argument. I think that it has to appeal to everyone.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Question 4. I didn't have any further observations or questions. I think we probably considered that. We talked about the essay. We talked about people's views on the essay. And again, it's probably going to start sort of going down into the detail of the sites to really sort of try and unpick these issues, especially around sort of issues. Question 5 is about where new developments occur in South villages. Is a scale, type, and distribution of housing important to character, role, and function. We've already talked about how it would and the reasons behind it at the very sort of strategic level. And again, we can get on to talk about some of the actual sort of locational specific impacts around county appearance and viewpoints, etc., and sort of wider landscape issues. But just in terms of the sort of spatial strategy, was character and appearance and landscape, were these factors considered as part of presumably we'll talk about it tomorrow, what site selection methodology, the essay, how we're sort of, it's been talking a lot about numbers and strategies, but about sort of character of a settlement, how is that taken into account in these considerations of growth of settlements and what could accommodate?
I'll kick off, sir. They clearly were considered, because that's the basis. I think what we've been saying in relation to settlement hierarchy, it's one of the number of factors that we considered. And in fact, we had the example this morning of Brenchley, where that those considerations had a major bearing on not putting forward allocations, and indeed that that had a bearing on the sort of high numbers that Horseman Den has been mentioned, particularly in terms of not having the landscape character constraints. But landscape character was assessed through the plan. Landscape sensitivity work is one of our evidence documents, and there's an awful lot as well in relation to, and we list at paragraph 46 of our evidence the range of heritage, ecological, and other considerations that were taken into account, and then look at how the application of those to different settlements. So yes, they were all considered. Whether you get a proportionate response into each one is another matter, but in effect, they were all considered on a, as I've said before, on a sort of a like-for-like basis, taking all those things into account.
This goes back to, obviously, people will, professional judgment within this around, in particular sites, etc., and no doubt people will disagree with those. But in terms of the actual high-level strategy, and I think it goes back to what we talked about this morning, there was no predetermined level of growth for each settlement. You weren't just looking at numbers in isolation. It wasn't a quantitative assessment of, okay, can settlement A accommodate 1,000 dwellings, yes or no, and then trying to match sites to that is actually done with a sort of more sort of nuanced and specific approach by looking at individual sites.
I think at the draft plan stage, we looked at a number of sites, thinking of sites around on the northern edge, so the main urban area above Southborough, that we subsequently withdrew, and a number of other sites I've mentioned before in the OMB, which was subsequently withdrew in the higher order centres particularly. So we did look, or at least consult on, a range of options where, on further reflection and interrogation of their impact on character, we withdrew. But sorry, David.
I'll just say, I mean, the consideration of landscape has been in at the start of the process. The landscape character assessment for the whole borough was updated in 2017, very beginning. And in addition to that, we then commissioned a sensitivity study to take account of new methodologies in landscape sensitivity assessment. A previous study having been a sensitivity and capacity study for the south. So with those pieces of evidence, we also had a relatively up-to-date ANB management plan, as I say, every 5 years. And for the ANB, we had the components of the ANB mapped and provided by the ANB unit. So we had a lot of evidence that was necessary to consider the landscape effect. We even had things like the historic landscape characterisation, which was done in collaboration with the Highwood ANB unit. We updated our ancient woodland inventory. We had a farmsteads guidance, which particularly sprung from work with the Highwood ANB unit. We had work on historic parks and gardens, which has been done with help of the ANB unit and English Heritage. So we had a very good evidence base for the landscape. And as a result of Reg 18, we engaged with the ANB unit and Natural England, looking at the work we've done and deciding what further work to be done for the Reg 19, and that resulted in both the setting study of the AOB and also the static or the IA work.
Okay, so Jeff,
thank you, sir. Just very short, it's our answer to question 5, which I'm not going to repeat, but there does need to be focus, of course, on all the elements of your question from the NPPF, the scale, type and distribution, and whether it's proportionate to the character, role and function. We've set out evidence, which we'll come on to tomorrow, and then maybe later, on extra care elderly need, but we've set out where the existing allocation, for example, in Pembury, they're in villages, Group C settlement, frankly disproportionate to their low tier status. And we do say that for obvious reasons, a greater level of extra care provisions, going back to a theme others have been taking you to, should have been targeted to Tunbridge Wells, which has the most sustainable settlement pattern. The last point, just to say, sir, to bear in mind now that probably is the evolution of the MPPF, is when we're looking at distribution and making places sustainable, where you're making somewhere sustainable, we've now got to look at things like carbon footprint. It's not good enough now just to say we can make what would otherwise be a rural field or something sustainable by building roads and building, without taking into account that carbon footprint. And that's important also for distribution. So we're not, and that's why we're saying we should be going also targeting places like Tunbridge Wells, where you've got pre-existing infrastructure, rather than having to either not be able to provide it in lower tier or trying to build new stuff. Thank you, sir.
okay, thank you.
I wanted to move on, I think, start on question 6 with the A and B and find the right space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So looking at how do the A and B designated influence the scale, type and distribution of housing development. So I'm taking scale as meaning either the geographical extent of the site allocation or the number of units that are going to be yielded from that site. So my concern is that because of the visual interest of the A and B, is the automatic assumption going to be that in order to be less damaging in terms of visual unity, that will end up with lots of low density development in the A and B? And if the A and B is to be lost to development, controversially, shouldn't we be optimising those sites in order to address housing needs? And if that's unpalatable, having high density development in the A and B, then we once again need to be looking at paragraph 11B, looking at housing requirements.
We heard yesterday, partially answered this question yesterday, where I asked participants whether or not the AONB and the Greenbelt should restrict development. And we talked yesterday about the council, so we said, you know, did you say, okay, the AONB is often saying, well, we're not going to look at development there. We talked that through yesterday. So just to be clear from your position and representations, is your position that should be the case, that the council just shouldn't look at the AONB, or that actually a sort of pragmatic discussion needs to be had about the AONB and whether some sensitive and appropriate development could be located there?
I think probably, yes, it needs to be pragmatic, but not getting lost in a situation where potentially that valuable resource is lost and it's not yielding much, and therefore even more of that valuable resource is lost. And going back to the themes throughout our representations, it's about increasing density in established existing communities in order that these greenfield sites aren't lost, and it makes the development more sustainable. I just worry that the desirability of the site in the AONB, which is quite an unusual thing, will attract a development that's quite low density but high value.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that on Krista, guys.
Thank you. Just answering questions about how landscape evidence was taken into account. We do set out in our representations, there were 2 sensitivity assessments undertaken, one Tunbridge Wells Town, and then one later was undertaken for Paddock Wood, Horseman, Hawkhurst, and Cranbrook. And our reading of the 2 studies showed that the Paddock Wood assessment appears to score similarly to Royal, Tunbridge Wells, and Southborough, and perhaps even more sensitive in some places the way that it was assessed. So we've set that out, we've summarized that in our representations. So it's unclear as to how that landscape impact was taken on into consideration for Paddock Wood. And there was the Council to the Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment, LVIA, proposed applications back in November 2020. But that was only, as far as I understand, only looked at sites within the High Weald A1B and didn't look at sites within Paddock Wood or Tudley. And Tudley also wasn't looked at in the landscape, the original landscape study, as far as I'm aware.
So the landscape sensitivity study and the landscape character assessment, as I covered the appropriate areas. The LVA was particularly commissioned to deal solely with major development in High Weald. That is correct. But the landscape was scored through the essay and through the Sheila work as well. Officers visited every site in order to do those reports and make their conclusions based on the evidence they had, which included historic landscape characterisation, ancient woodland, landscape features, etc. So decisions were properly informed. And then specifically for Paddock Wood and for Tudley Garden Village, we undertook the setting studies, and they have informed and talked to the emerging master plans for those developments. And it's important to know that New England have accepted our evidence base as in landscape terms.
I just got a question about the settings study. Was that only in relation to the AONB?
Yes. The setting study was commissioned with that purpose to look at the relationship with the designated landscape that obviously informed landscape choices and policy associated with those sites.
We'll go to the corner then, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, sir. The question relating to justification for distribution of new housing development, we've drawn the distinction that the council have accepted major employment development within these areas to the north of Tunbridge Wells through an allocation within the plan. And that was rightly justified by exceptional circumstances, which, as we discussed yesterday, is the test set out within the framework. And that approach in relation to that employment site and that policy approach from the framework can equally apply to residential major development within the area. And I sense from the nature of the discussions and the nature of the written statements and so forth, there seems to be a mental block to major housing development within the AONB as opposed to major employment development within the AONB. So there seems to be a slight inconsistency there. And then secondly, the answer to why perhaps no major development, residential development in the AONB has occurred, is the point I made back in the stage one hearings. When they looked at their landscape sensitivity study, that did not look at small enough parcels which would have enabled perhaps more sensitive proposals, more reflective of the characteristics and sensitivities of the AONB to come forward and be appraised. So for those reasons, I don't believe the justification and approach to the AONB for meeting residential development needs in sustainable locations has been adequately and appropriately set out through this plan making process.
Mr. Neil, then we'll take up.
Just a short point, mainly points of clarification from Mr. Scully. Can we just understand the rationale for, as I understood it, carrying out an AONB setting study for the Chudley site, please. Let's just focus on the Chudley site, for the Chudley site. As I understood, that was carried out as part of the master planning work. So is it right to say that the AONB, in terms of informing the strategic decision to go to a two-settlement strategy, i.e. the decision taken at Reg 18, was that not informed by any AONB setting study? Did that happen later in the process?
The AONB setting study was commissioned in direct response to concerns raised by Natural England. The council wasn't concerned. The council thought it made the right decision. Natural England raised the concerns, so we undertook the study. And we found it's been very helpful and informative.
That with respect, and sorry to say if I've meant to be asking these questions through you, but if I could just ask, it's just to do with the timing of that study. I accept it was done, and I understand who asked for it, but did it inform decisions taken at the Reg 18 stage? No, or was it taken later?
Post Reg 18, as I think we explained quite clearly. The setting study was done post 18. At Reg 18, we were fairly confident of our assessment based on the evidence we had. But Natural England raised the concern, and so did the NAB, and so we addressed that concern.
And just finally, sir, if I may ask, as I understand it, LVIAs were carried out to assess to assess the impact of potential major development in the AONB. Again, was that can you clarify at what stage those were carried out, these LVIAs?
This is all in the evidence set out in our reports, but they were again done in consultation as a result of requests and discussions with Natural England post Reg 18.
And is also we talked earlier about the sites that the phrase came out of the plan because the plan is the submission plan. But from Reg 18 to Reg 19, we talked about some of the sites that was removed. That work failed to.
And just to go back to the points made by Mr. Bond in terms of major, we have allocated major development for housing, or proposed to allocate major development for housing in the ANOB. There was considerable objection from Natural England and the ANOB about the Reg 18 plan, both in terms of individual sites, the quantum of development, and the sort of distribution development in the ANOB. So we took those comments very seriously. We commissioned the LBAA, we undertook other work and studies to get moved from Reg 18 to Reg 19. And as a result, withdrew a number of those potential allocations and or reduced them in size and modified them and improved supporting policy. One of the largest of those, not the largest, was site Turnder in Cranbrook, which you'll have heard about, and is sitting with the Secretary of State. That was 167 units, additional units, and that was called in by a request for call in by Natural England. And that was the level of concern at 167 units. And we do think our approach of major strategic housing in the ANOB is not acceptable and is not comparable with the scheme for employment developments at Romford Road. And in terms of criticism of the landscape sensitivity study, not identifying small enough parcels to accommodate potential allocation sites, because the methodology is based on landscape character and differences between areas of character and areas of sensitivity. If it had found that a smaller area or another area similar to Mr. Bond's site was of a different sensitivity, it would have identified it as such as a separate parcel.
Let's move on, and sort of final question really, we'll have a break. Just one question here, which is about safeguarding land. I haven't identified any areas of safeguarding land in between the urban area and the redevelopment, obviously, development needs, and council report essentially said no, and it wasn't considered necessary at this point. You did mention the rural fringe sites. Could you just, and again, probably might even discuss this tomorrow potentially, what are the rural fringe sites? What are they now? And what are they proposed as in the submission plan? Are they already being removed from the green belt?
So they have been removed from the green belt when the green belt was drawn up, when the new area was administrative area was formed. That's in the we've got an answer to that, which is the matter. Question 10. Yeah, sorry, it's table 7. Sorry, so I'm just being passed on, which probably gives you the answer. This is matter 3, limited of development, issue 3, and question 10, which sets out the rural fringe sites and their sort of status, etc. The ones we went round earlier today in those maps, and we showed you that where the green belt was drawn and the ANOB was drawn, was essentially where the rural fringe sites used to be as well. And so that gives you an indication of what their current condition is. But this answer, I think, sets it out in detail. Is that right? Yeah. If you wanted to address that now, I'll call my colleague up to.
No, that's fine. But there was one question about another parcel of land. I don't think it was rural fringe, but you'll correct me. I think you referred to it as Colbrook House.
Yes.
So what's that at the moment? Is that in the green belt?
It is at the moment. The proposal is to remove it from the green belt, but safeguard it.
Okay, so when you refer to safeguarding it, because it's not shown as anything on the policy map, is it? What's it shown as?
No,
just white land.
It would be, yes.
Because it would still be ANOB, I think.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's still within the area of
Yeah, it's still within the area of
it's outside the limits of built development. just be, if it were safeguarded for future employment, it would essentially still be in the Airbnb. It's not actually, there is no policy which actually sets out what it's safeguarding for.
So it's proposed to be removed from the greenbelt, not allocated to development. On that basis, what's the reason for removing it from the greenbelt?
It was initially, I should give you some context. It was it's a complex, so there's a park and estate, essentially vacant with on the edge of the town. It's to the north of the North Farm, and the thinking was that it would provide an opportunity for a quite bespoke office sort of campus type development. Should this particular need arise, probably beyond the planned period, because we have RTW 17, the King Standing Way site, immediately to the south of it. So it was essentially safeguarding it for future employment should it be needed in the long term, conscious it's remaining in the green belt now.
If the needs don't exist now, there's no essentially justification for it as an employment site. We talked about the needs yesterday and the supply versus the need. So there's nothing lined up for the site. There's no need for it. It's not safeguarded because it's just white land. You don't know what your future needs will be. Could be reviewed when you review the plan. Do you think there's exceptional circumstances to move from the green belt state?
It was submitted as a site with proposals as in the call for site. It does appear to have an uncertain sort of future of property, and I suppose the thoughts were that in an area that if
the particular point, sir, was about amendments to the green belt boundary for beyond the time.
Yeah, for permanence. Yes, yes.
Sorry, there's so many pieces of paper.
What I think you need to do is ahead of the session in June, where we talk about the employment allocations. See, the one Jason's got back, which we talked about yesterday, about ahead of that session, because I think that's quite a logical place to discuss it. I think you need to give some consideration as to whether or not exceptional circumstances exist to justify moving on a green belt. I put a marker down that I'm dubious about it, but bear in mind, I sort of raised it a bit on the hop today. Let's return to it on that day. I think that's a natural place for it, but do give it some consideration before the session. Mr. Jones?
I know you want to finish. It's just in answer to question 8, and I'm not going to repeat what we've said, but just to add something, because it arose yesterday, in terms of whether, obviously we want our site in, but in terms of the alternative being a safeguarded site for elderly people, extra care, to bear in mind, we say the new evidence that we've had updated yesterday by the various parties on the affordability issue on, if I can use the term, conventional housing, which means the prospect of conventional housing sites coming forward, unless to be used for extra care or elderly care, is we would submit much less than a need, therefore, to be specifically allocating. And if there's any doubts, safeguarding, because of that position. That's just it arises out of what was said yesterday.
Respond, any quick points?
Yeah, thank you, sir. You will have remember yesterday, sir, we discussed the issue of capped and uncapped levels of housing provision. If you keep the plan with a capped level of housing provision, that doesn't reduce the level of housing need itself, and therefore that additional housing need that's not being met will need to be addressed through a, let's just call it the early, I'd like to say the early review of the local plan. So in that context, when you go to 140 of the framework, where the council had rightly identified exceptional circumstances justifying the review of greenbelt boundaries, so they dipped into that sphere of planning, they should then ensure that those new greenbelt boundaries endure beyond the planned period, 2038. There's two approaches. One consistent with 140 is that those new greenbelt boundaries are defined to endure beyond the planned period. Therefore, that must imply, given there's a recognition that the rules are not being met, those needs will have to address, that must imply potentially additional incursions into the greenbelt. So the plan should ensure that those boundaries reflect that. The alternative, of course, is that there's clear recognition, contrary to 140, and the intended permits of the greenbelt boundaries that potentially within a couple of years, those boundaries will be reviewed again. If that is the course that is to be taken, that should be hopefully acknowledged for transparency and levels of expectation. And the only last point I'd make, sir, is that there are examples where greenbelt safeguarded land exists, even though it's within the AONB too. So you have safeguarded land within AONB. It's not an allocation for development, you're just safeguarding land for potential future uses. Thank you.
Is there any final brief points?
Sorry, sir, no, my
Thank you very much.
name take was up.
Okay, we'll take a break. We'll come back and go through issue 3. I think it should still get done. We'll take 15 minutes until 22. Yeah. Okay, thank you. joining us. Resume and continue. So on to issue 3, which is around the limits to build development. The questions that I really wanted to go into here are around. Since question 3 really, and we can come back to the specifics of individual settlement boundaries. Also, there's limits to build development topic paper and see some representations on that. But one thing I do want to concentrate a bit of time to some rest of this next session is where the site allocation is concerned. The limits to build development topic paper says that only the developable areas have been included, and that landscape buffers, open space, outdoor recreation areas have been excluded. Obviously, we're taking into account that these are site allocations and the detailed design is yet to be worked up. The question really was twofold. So what's the justification for that? And do you think that that's a justified and effective approach?
Well, I'll set out in the council statement under question 3, paragraph 18. The main reason is that it's considered inappropriate to have developments in these locations because they're open status, so landscape buffers and outdoor recreation areas. Their open status and character and setting in the wider landscape should be protected. And then we go on to set out the justification or the criteria that apply to that in the limits development topic paper, that's CD 3.82. And criteria C, D, and E on page 11 of the topic paper are applicable. Basically, LDB boundaries should not have an adverse impact on landscape character. Any designated areas of national or local landscape importance should not result in harm to the character, appearance, or setting of the settlement. So that's basically what the criteria stipulates, and that's our justification.
So where you've got these boundaries that this is for site allocations, we'll come on to the next question, which is about the strategic site, but for site allocations, where they exclude landscape areas, is this existing sort of tree belts and things like that, or is it things that are actually proposed or envisaged as part of development? So are we talking about existing landscape features or proposed landscape areas that you want to screen into new development?
It could be both actually, yeah. So if you've got an existing tree belt, for example, you might want to retain that, or as part of the site allocation, you might be seeking some sort of landscape buffer along the boundary, so it allows sufficient space for that to be carried out.
So it might help, I wasn't sort of prepared for this, but just looking at some of the allocation, I'll just look at the Pembury.
Okay, yeah.
One just into that page. It is the pre-submission local plan policy map, inset map 29. I think there you've got a number of allocations with and the allocations themselves include sort of the green areas on the southern side, but it's been identified through landscape assessment work. In this case, part of the work done by Hanks and Duckett about sort of retaining a broad belt on the southern side towards the A21. So essentially you're looking to clarify the extent of development there are a couple of other areas there which don't have them. And looking at other locations, essentially, it's providing sufficient land to get as Bradley says, an effective landscape buffer, often reinforcing an existing boundary edge or tree line to sort of help accommodate the development in the landscape. I take the point, and I've dealt with this a lot, in terms of when a scheme comes in, it might not exactly align with that boundary. You may get a few houses sort of just creeping beyond the LBD and perhaps pulling in other places, and that happens. I think for the purposes of the local plan, it's really useful to indicate the approximate extent of the development. You can see that in a number of other inset maps as well, where they're essentially on the outward edge of the settlement.
I think it's just worth adding that a number of these features and proposals are identified specifically by the Angus and Bucket Landscape Visual Impact Assessment as important to the acceptability of the scheme, or some identified through the Greenbelt studies, so and other sort of landscape work. So it's, they're not just sprung out of nowhere.
So you don't think there's any potential conflicts at sort of the plan application stage, albeit that there might be, but there'll be very limited. So
yes, we did a very similar thing with the south, and there was some modifications on some of the sites when the actual applications come in, but they were fully justified by the submission of a detailed LVIA and the detailed submissions and so on. So it's perfectly easy to accommodate those any sort of minor modifications within a development management situation.
It sets the parameters really of where development should go and where it shouldn't, and like so there's some flexibility built in that.
Okay, lady, apologies, I can't read your name.
Thank you. Lisa Skinner on behalf of Roscon Strategic Land. I'm just going to try and combine a few points here so I don't have to repeat myself. And I sort of make more reference, if you like, in particular to the inset map 26 for North London and the corresponding policy AL/HO2. Whilst we don't have any particular issue with how the council defines the limits to build development, we do have concerns in terms of how the lines are actually drawn and shown on the plan. And we all know when it comes to a planning application, it does make a difference between what side of the line you're on. And if you're on the wrong side of it, it makes one set of policies come in, on another side you might be viewed favourably. And therefore it's quite an important point. And where the red line is, if you like, for the built development, that doesn't necessarily correspond, as we're aware, in terms of what the site allocation is. And I think when we were asked later on, sir, is that sort of definition and where those lines are drawn, are they effective? I don't believe they are. And I also believe they can be quite confusing, certainly to the public. On that 26, for example, if you look, we've got a red line which defines the settlement limit. We then have a blue line that defines the site allocation. And then when you come to the actual inset map, we've just got a red line. We then have the council's view of where maybe residential development should take place, where maybe open space should take place, and community. And what concerns us is the confusion between those lines for a member of the public or developer looking at them. Also, they're a result of what we would describe as high-level assessments. You don't have the landscape visual impacts in terms of a detailed site until those technical reports start coming forward as part of an application. And when you haven't got that detailed assessment, that can frustrate with design, it can restrict the approach to development, and that can mean we're not getting a proper comprehensive form of development that actually may come forward with slightly more flexibility. I understand what the council is saying about, oh, well, it's approximate, but when you actually look at the wording, for example, in ALH2, and I don't want to go into detail, but it is an important point. When you look at point 6 of that policy, it's quite explicit. Residential development shall be located along the areas identified for residential use on the site layout plan, with the provision of a village hall on the land indicated for community use on the site layout plan. That is contradictory to the so-called flexibility in the approximate extent that we've just heard. And I think that's where our concern is, and that we believe that really the extent of built development should encompass the whole of the site application land, and then proper development, proper design, and bearing in mind developments coming forward now also have to take into account in future biodiversity net improvements. That means we're going to get a development coming forward that is most appropriate following all of the technical analysis. And at the moment, we believe the way this is set out, it actually could frustrate that coming forward. Thank you.
So what are the policies to look at what do the policies actually require then? So for each of the allocations, let's just look at ALH2 then. What does it say?
Part 7 is the operative criterion in this case.
So 6 as well, residential development should be located on the areas of residential use on the site layout. So what's the site layout plan there in that context? Is that the yeah, that's okay, maps, that's the map above. Right, okay. Okay, so do you think that is flexible enough? Is it being too prescriptive at a local plan level?
Also, I haven't found it a difficulty with the South one. We've had pre-application discussions and applications on a number of these sites, and generally I haven't come across an issue where developers have really said it's a significant problem. Some of those developers are here.
I think so. I think there's 2 separate issues here. One is about the actual LVD itself, and the other is about the distribution of uses within the site. And obviously, the community use, understandably, request of the parish council is that nearest the village centre with the residential beyond. I think that makes sense in land use terms. In terms of the actual site itself, you've got a designated site to the west, which you wanted a buffer to, and it's relatively open to the south, as Lee from Roscon know, and it's important there to actually make sure there is an effective buffer to the south. There's an existing hedgerow along the road. There's looking to strengthen that, but that's within the LBD. We haven't been so prescriptive. It's really on the outside edge where it's really important to convey this. And I understand a point, but a more important point is that pressure my development management colleagues will be under to really just have a hedge line or along that boundary if we didn't put it in. And I suspect that's what would happen. So I think it is important to show these whether on the outside edge when there's good, strong landscape reasons for it. And obviously it's a development management stage, then it may be interrogated in more detail, but broadly we believe it to be correctly positioned.
Do you think, just thinking out loud, do you think, given that these are essentially indicative areas, because you don't know the precise layout of the development, like you said, we'll get schemes coming forward, informed by the plan design, you might get some outline applications come forward to do exactly that. But if they are indicative, you think the plan needs to make it clear that they're indicative?
You'll see, sir, we've got some sites, such as HO1, there is no landscape buffer at all, because it's, you know, and that doesn't say there isn't landscape features there, it's actually contained by a really significant hedgerow. And that's been sort of clearly identified. With some other sites, these areas are shown in relation to very specific features that are on the site and have been established through sort of further work, such as CRS3 at Cranbrook, where there's a very large site, but only a very restricted areas proposed for the development. And that's been based on a very detailed work. So we have tried to take a sort of proportionate approach to this issue, bearing in mind the challenges of delivering high quality development that's going to be integrated into the landscape, and the landscape concerns that have been raised. We think this is a mechanism that's been proven to help deliver that kind of response, rather than leaving it entirely open to a later date. We're being really clear about features that need to be retained or built into a scheme. The example that Mr. Marlowe mentioned at Pembury is continuous across P1, P2 and P3 to build in a new landscape buffer as a direct result of sort of landscape work and green belt work. So we think it's important to show on a plan.
So if I could just add finally that Mr. Scully made reference to the site allocations for the plan 2016, where it's essentially a similar approach in relation to the identification of relevant buffers and areas of landscaping. And so we've had planning applications considered against those for the last 5-6 years or so, particularly when taken together with design and access statements and other development management policies. This council has, there's a strong track record of those site applications coming forward, of it not being an issue for developers or for the council in terms of considering those applications. I think some of the feedback we've had is that it's been helpful in giving the parameters for the developers to work within and informing their design. But ultimately, it will have obviously the other evidence, other studies, etc., that input into the planning application, but within those parameters established through those policies.
What does the site allocation say? Does it say the same wording, or does that refer to sort of indicative areas or illustrative areas? Or
Can't remember offhand. I think it's something similar. You know, it says this is the area for development and this is the area of green space.
In the main, most of these policies in their supporting text identify those kinds of constraints or considerations which bear upon the developable area, and those elements within the developable area that need to be put to use. If we take HO2, map 61 shows the areas to be developed for particular purposes and the area of landscaping. If you compare that allocation to the map, which shows the limits of built development, it's drawn tightly around the purple and buff areas, excluding landscaping areas to the west and south. You can do that in your own time, of course. Okay. So what I'm going to suggest is when we go through each of these sites, we can look to see whether or not they're justified by reference to what's already in the plan, and whether or not it might be expedient in regard to the requirements of the NPPF to introduce less data.
Gentleman at the back, yeah.
Yes, I am. I mean, I'm interested in the Kingwood site. Now, that site was originally considered small site and rejected in stage 18 because of the landscape reasons. It was not approved in the Greenbelt Plan Stage 2, and therefore didn't appear in the draft local plan. Then all of a sudden it reappeared in the pre-submission local plan, and then without any apparent justification. However, looking at it more closely, although no information was given, it appeared under a new number. It turned out that it was the original site which had been rejected by the Greenbelt study, but with an additional area tacked onto the side, which was now put in as a greenbelt, as a buffer, an open space to create a new edge to the greenbelt. Now, I'm not entirely in favour of that greenbelt, but anyway, this was said, and it was put in the plan. When I talked to before the PSLP submissions to the council, I was assured that the land, only land that would be drawn from the greenbelt was the original. It was a developable land shown on the plan, which was the original site which had been rejected by the greenbelt boundaries, and on the greenbelt boundary. And the other land would not be developable. And the plan, as the submission plan, is that's exactly what it shows. The developable land, the original site is clearly defined and is shown as developable, and it's removed from the greenbelt and put into the built development. And the other land, which is the buffer and open space, is left in the greenbelt. And I think it's very clear on the drawings of those boundaries, and that is exactly what I was assured would happen. So I mean, to hear that is not actually a definite position would surprise me, and it's certainly not clear on the plan that there's any doubt about where the boundary goes, and the land which is allocated for the development is the original land put forward by the developers. So they've got the land they asked for. There's a green belt buffer which satisfies the green belt study people, and it's what I was assured I was going to get. So, I mean, as I say, I think what they've done in the plan is appropriate for that site, and I don't hope that stays the same. Of course, it could be changed in a review of the plan if there was something. It's not absolutely cast in stone. A review of the plan in the future, we might bring that up, but until the council approves such a change in a review change of the plan, then developers will not be able to apply to extend the site into the buffer zone because it's green belt. So it's still, it would remain protected.
Yeah, the buffer on that site remains in the green belt, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
So, and I think that site, R2W5, is a good example because the buffer there is designed on the existing landscape feature.
Yeah.
And the road out to that work. And I think it just raises an important point. These are, and it was said, I think, yesterday, some of these sites have been really difficult choices. And those choices have been made on the basis of these plans. These are what was consulted on, these are what members considered in making these difficult choices. So I think we're reluctant to change that approach. And say for all the reasons about delivering a quality development.
Okay, so with slightly different approach there, with the with some other sites where you've got provisional limits to developments. Just talk to me about what they are, what sites they refer to, and why they're set out as provisional limits to development.
Okay, yeah, so the answer to this, well, this is basically question 5. And that's set out in the council's response of paragraph 28. First of all, the provisional LBDs relate only to the post-strategic sites, which we've been discussing earlier, at Paddock Wood and Land at East Capel, and the new garden settlement at Chudley Village. And as set out in the strategic sites topic paper, which is CD 3.67. It's basically considered appropriate that both of these strategic allocations should have a defined LBD, similar to others, settlements in the plan. But given that there's a high level approach to master planning and the development is going to be phased, it's considered that there isn't sufficient evidence at this stage to fully define the LBDs, so therefore provisional LBDs are put forward, and these are indicated on CD 3.59D1, which is inset map 4 for Paddock Wood, and CD 3.59F, which is the inset map for Chudley Village.
So you look at, if you look at Paddock Wood inset map, or the provisional limit hill development, is it fair to say that it essentially follows the extent of the various sites, does it not? Apart from that, there's one in the sort of southeast corner where there's an area that shows allocated but isn't within the provisional limits of development. So yeah, just looking at it fresh, it appears to just follow the extent of the sites. It's just the site boundaries. So it wasn't clear why you've allocated some sites. They've got clear boundaries because they've shown on a map, and they've got roads and various other boundaries to them. Why then it would be shown as this sort of provisional boundary rather than just that's the boundary?
Yeah, it's drawn within the actual boundary, about 20 metres.
It's a buffer of 20 metres around the edge, the inner edge. And that
okay, is that all the way around there?
Yeah, so it is actually 20 metres. It doesn't, you probably can't appreciate that looking at the map. But,
okay.
Yeah.
So what's the reason for that then?
As a landscape buffer. So I think it stated it was because the master planning that's been done is high level as appropriate at this stage of the plan making. And it was just to sort of reflect on or acknowledge that it will require a strong landscape buffer, particularly land to the west, which is then onto the green belt. And it was considered that rather than just have the provision to limits to built development to reflect the allocation boundary by bringing it in by 20 metres as set out, that would establish the principle of the landscape buffer. By keeping it provisional, we would determine the actual limits for development once the outline planning applications or SBDs had provided a more fixed understanding of that. The only exclusion you'll notice is at the bottom south eastern corner, there's sort of a little shoe heel that sticks out that the red line doesn't follow the 20 metres there, and Mrs. Scully might be able to provide some more information, but that stemmed from some landscaping feedback and assessment we'd had that suggested that it should be retained.
Should be a question about that later, about the land to the east of the allocation, and that's the answer. This will be on the west side, the new boundary to the outer boundary to, or the inset boundary for the settlement of the greenbelt. So it's important it's retained as a strong landscape feature. And it should be adjusted when the master plan is confirmed, because there will be significant areas of open space within the development, which would then be taken out of the or be removed, I suppose, from the field area through the redrawing of the LBD.
So when you say the redrawing, what are we talking plan review, how would you redraw that?
That would be at the 5-year last adopted plan review.
Was Ashton comments?
Thank you, sir. You've seen my representations, you've seen what I've said about the anomaly as I see it within the southeast corner of the land to the east of Paddock Wood on why the limits of built development have been identified in the way they have in that area. I'm not going to go any further than that. It's quite clear what my view is, the local authority know what my view is. We've had such detailed discussions on the master planning for the land to the east in advance of submission of an application. I really do think that it would make sense for that area to be reviewed as part of this plan process, given where we now are. I don't think I need to say any more. It's probably a matter between them and me. But
what's the reason for excluding that then?
So the national assessment study looked at this whole area, and you've got a specific question on that about it was land east, particularly Queen Street, which was to not be built on, and it included that parcel in the southeast. We've allowed a small area to be included within the allocation, but part of it is to be purely as a landscape buffer.
I'll just confirm that's matter 6, issue 3, question 18.
So what's the council's intention for that parcel of land then?
To form part of the landscape buffer because it's important in particular strategic views of the Atwood as well. From the area of understanding and views.
So in terms of what happens to is that you're expecting that going to be provided, yes, or you're expecting it to be?
Yes, so we include within the red line of the application, so it's clearly part of the development, but we exclude it from the development.
Sasha and colleague next to what are your views now on this indicative limits to build development? And it just shows me 20 metres all the way around the allocation. Is that something that's promoting these sites that you think is effective, or is it, do you agree that it actually is to resolve through the master planning and that would essentially inform the limits to build development thereafter?
my normal view would be that it should be informed by the master planning process. The fact of the matter is, the land east of Paddock Wood, because it's not in the Greenbelt, is being promoted as an application that is going in quite soon. So the local authority have had quite detailed discussions with us, and in our submission, so I've provided you with part of the illustrative master plan that goes with that potential application, which does show development within the area that is excluded from the limits of built development as currently shown on the local plan as submitted. And as I say, on the basis of those discussions, which include detailed discussions with Design South East, we've been through 2 Design South East panel meetings, we've been through detailed discussions with the local authority themselves, to now have a situation where the limits of built development show one thing and our application is going to show another. And I accept what Mr. Scully says, that we can demonstrate right through the master planning process, through the DAS and through the LDIA. But I just think it sends mixed messages to the local community. And I don't therefore see why it can't be changed through minor modifications to this plan that conforms to time, rather than left for a local plan review.
If I add my view to that, which is obviously slightly different. Particularly to the northwest of Paddock Wood, we are reliant obviously on land coming out of the Greenbelt. So, but we are progressing with discussions with the council in terms of going through developing an SPD. So discussions will be had in good time. So we're some way behind Miss Ashton and the East. So to my mind, and it's in my reps, that I don't particularly have an issue with this. I think the fact that it can be dealt with in the next local plan review, when we've been through the collaborative process of writing an SPD and co-producing that, I think we'll all understand why we're developing where we're developing, and then that will be progressed through the next local plan review. I don't think it prejudices anybody because the SPD will be consulted upon. So people will have a view, will see what's happening and why it's happening and have that explanation. So, but as I say, we are in a slightly different position and lagging behind somewhat because of the policy situation. So we're in a different position. Just to add to that, I mean, one of the themes of my reps is that, you know, we are in a planning process and what's appropriate at different stages of that planning process. And I think the council's approach to do an SPD and take things forward following, you know, all the analysis that's been evidenced and then the master planning and then going forward is the appropriate way of doing things. And obviously, as we combine and we do that collaboratively, then that makes it a much more transparent and positive planning process. So I think it's the right way.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, sir. It's very concerning that the single largest, you know, strategic site within the local plan doesn't have the specifics to inform what sort of buffers might be required. But you have a number of very small sites where the development boundaries and areas have been very carefully considered and set out in the policies map and the applications. We think it's entirely confusing. Why a 20-meter buffer around the entire site allocation? I think we've already suggested that this should all be addressed through a local plan review, which I guess would be in 5 years after the local plan is adopted. What is that going to do in terms of directing development and growth and telling applicants and the council where development should take place, where buffers should be located? That will all be presumably already sort of dealt with. Or it could be done through an SPD, which we hear is going to be consulted on, but won't actually go through an examination process. I think it just sort of demonstrates the council doesn't really know where the development's likely to take place or what sort of buffers are required. But it does come back to my previous points about the landscape sensitivity work, which did show that there is a lot of landscape sensitivity around Paddock Wood, not just in relation to the A or B sort of land to the east of Paddock Wood, which we heard about, but surrounding Paddock Wood in its entirety, as I understand it. So it's not just about in relation to the A or B, but other landscape character issues and landscape impact issues for the development to consider. So we're quite confused by the rationale behind the proposal here.
Yeah, so very briefly, I won't repeat what Mr. Hayes has said, but we endorse that. It does show the fact that the council hasn't really sorted out what it thinks are the appropriate limits. The site really is a concern that it hasn't properly assessed the impacts of this development. We're talking specifically now about the Tudor site. I completely endorse that. It is a deep concern that judgments have been made about the level of landscape impact, yet it's then said in the same breath, oh, well, we don't quite know where the limits of the built development would be, let's all leave it manana and provisional. That just seems inconsistent and concerning as to whether in fact the impacts have been properly thought about at an appropriate stage. We're particularly concerned about the SPD approach. We think there should be further detail at this stage to inform the appropriateness of this particular allocation. Thank you, sir.
In terms of Tudor Village, Tudor Village is inside map 8, which is different insofar as the indicative limits of development there are obviously more clearly set back from site boundaries, etc. So again, what's that based on? And where you've got we've got the indicative site boundary or the indicative limits to built development, and then you've got a gap to the remainder of the allocation. Is that to be removed from the green belt as well, or is it just the limits to built development that will be removed from the green belt?
So, sorry, sir, I haven't got my green belt stuff in front of me, so I wasn't expecting to answer that particular question.
I think that's a question, isn't it, under matter 6, but the whole allocation has to come out.
So the whole allocation
It needs to come out of the green belt, indeed, and it's the reason that this isn't is slightly more refined, if you like, is because the master planning work that's been undertaken by the Hadrow Estate, which is in its delivery strategy, has progressed further and has enabled us to reach a view on some more extensive landscape boundaries and obviously the areas of ancient woodland that are on the outskirts of the site, peripheral of the site. So, you know, it doesn't mean the ancient woodland within the site here on Paddock Wood would be, you know, in line with the DM policies in place, could be built on, but we've been able to exclude them with the appropriate buffer in a more logical form for this settlement.
The boundary to the north, sir, that's been drawn for the LBD is because further north gets into areas of sort of flooding and those issues, and so it's constrained in terms of the development. There's no strong green belt boundary there, and so in terms of the green belt release, in order to ensure the green belt boundary endures beyond the planned period, it's drawn further out. To make sure it follows a strong boundary. And that's answered in your question, sir, in relation, I think, to tomorrow's session. We can look at that again.
Because we discussed the RTP5 site, which ended up the back raise, didn't we? And that had limits to build development. And then the landscape buffer was retained within the green belt.
That's because the landscape buffer provided a strong boundary. I think that's in the MPPF. I think it's that paragraph number, section F or something like that, where you have to draw to new green belt strong boundaries. There is no strong boundary there in Tudley Village on that part of the development. So you have to go to the next strong boundary, which is the road to the north.
Okay, any views on?
Can I just come back, sir, on the issues about the temporary LBD for these two settlements? I mean, obviously we drew that before the discussions we had, the detailed discussions we had with Susan Bashton and Ryden and Persimmon Homes. And so that was the way things were seen at that time. And you can see that the council is caught between trying to address concerns over here that we're going to make sure we deliver the development in the right place, and concerns about the way development may eventually appear. And so that's why this proposal has come forward, to try and address those concerns. And you can see in the master planning for instance, Paddock Wood, which is on page 150 of the submission paper plan, that there are significant areas of green space within that development, which wouldn't, according to the limits to build development criteria, normally be included. And so it will need to be adjusted to be consistent LBD boundaries elsewhere.
Do you think that obviously the process that you're going through demonstrates or perhaps suggests that setting provisional limits to build development isn't actually an effective thing to do? Because here you've got an example, haven't you? This is case study number one of what will happen in the future, is you're now left at these sort of debates and arguments over lines on plan.
We're arguing over a very, very small parcel and a very small part of the parcel in this particular case for the LBD. So I think it would be best to look at that in relation to your question when we look at that, just so you can appraise yourself of the actual situation that's going on there. But if that is the sum total of the problems that's given risen to a development along the whole of the side of Paddock Wood, then that could also indicate it's successful.
But at Paddock Wood, the limits to build development follows the entire site. It's the only bit where it doesn't, you're in conflict with.
Well,
So
I say it does also include the buffer and so on. So it's a difficult place to be with these kind of issues. We think it's a good approach.
we want to consider it is ultimately a policies map, so I am restricted in no locations that I can recommend to a policies map. But
say that you've got the maps actually identified in the plan itself. Might be helpful when you look at the inset maps, just to have regard also to the corresponding maps in the plan, which form part of the supporting element of the plan for the policy. You will see in relation to map 32 for Tudor that the inset map boundary pretty much follows the master plan to date. So these limits, as they're shown, reflect, as it were, the state of play at the time was deposited. So it may well be that there are changes since then, which may need to be taken into account as master planning is concerned, or that will be taken into account in due course. The question is whether or not setting those limits, as they've been set, for example, paddock would have any negative consequences for the positive approach to development, which the plan should promote. And that's something which can be considered on the day we consider that particular policy.
We'll see within the plan you have the within the plan you've got the extracts from the master plan, haven't you?
Yes.
I'll leave that to think about the council as to whether or not you think they are helpful in that context.
We'll certainly consider that.
I completely understand why you would put the master plan in the plan. Picking, members of community, pick the local plan and start to understand and appreciate what's being proposed. But then if plan applications start coming in and they're different, it then becomes, well, there's a master plan in the plan. Why doesn't it follow the master plan? And you have to try and explain, well, actually, that was just sort of indicative and there's just an idea of what might happen. So I'll leave that with you.
Thank you, Sir. Lisa Skinner, Roscoe. I think your summaries sort of hit the nail on the head on a few things. I do come back to policy ALHs who have been listening. I did want to come back on the council's comments. And there is a difference if the plan is clearly labelled as indicative. The plans that we are looking at here are not labelled as indicative, and the actual policy wording is very explicit. I noticed, the council officer said, oh, well, when we have, pre-applications discussions with developers, oh, well, they're quite happy and we've had a few and it's great. Well, I'm representing a developer that's had pre-application discussions. We have a planning application that's in, and I'm raising these issues because we don't know at this stage what the outcome of our planning application will be. But those detailed discussions that have been informed by technical reports do show changes to the areas that have been explicitly stated as residential and the areas explicitly stated for community use in the village hall. And if something's indicative, that's one thing. But if you look at particular policy wording, and when we look at 6, 7 and 8, so 6 and 7 in particular, it's explicit. So exactly what you've just said, sir, when the public or anyone's looking at the policies, straight away they're going to be saying, well, why is it different? So when we're looking at it at a plan level stage, surely if it's indicative, it should be quite clear that there is flexibility and not the wording saying that that's where things have to go, because that really doesn't help us in terms of moving forward. And I don't really feel when we're looking at this stage in a local plan, we should be saying, well, it's okay for a development manager officer later on to be flexible, because that officer is then going to be having to explain, well, why this bit's not here or why that bit's not there. That's not really good or constructive for everyone to understand a clear path. Thank you.
Do you think that's a soundness failing of the plan's approach, or just a differing opinion on a specific individual site about what should be open space and what shouldn't be?
I think it's a clarity point. I don't believe it goes to fundamental soundness in any respect, but I think it's important for clarity and to allow the flexibility, because when we're talking about developing sites to the optimum use and making sure that they come forward meeting all current standards, then there's a confusion between what the allocation boundary is and then what the built development limit is shown. So I think that's a clarification that needs to come forward. If we're indicative, we're indicative, but if we're leaving it for flexibility, then it needs to be quite clear.
Okay, we'll move on. I think they're the only questions I want to raise in this. Sorry, Mr. Bennett.
Put it up quite late, sorry. I just want to come back in the context of what has just been said. This northern edge of Tuley is a very good example of where the plan is rather vague. What I mean by that, sir, is the green boundary, it follows a natural definition. This dotted red line in the northern boundary of the LBD provisional is basically the line of the flood zone. Now, that's a moving beast, because obviously that will be reassessed as climate change information comes along. But my point being is they've assumed development right up to the flood zone. And yet it comes back to my point this morning on issue 1 about the strategy avoiding flood risk. They didn't carry out a level 2 strategic flood risk assessment for Tuley. And I believe they should have done, because it clearly interplays with that flood area.
Presumably where you've got a limit to build development here, again, that wouldn't necessarily indicate that that would be the hard edge of development. Presumably, again, that would be from master planning to, whether that was, development needs to be set further back, whether there needs to be some open space there as part of a wider flood management. It's not about this is where the back garden of house number whatever will finish.
As referred to, it's provisional for that reason. It's when planning for a scale of this size, it's determined that the master planning should dictate that, and that would take on board the detailed master planning and many factors that need to be considered, such as flood risk and landscape design.
What you have done in the limits to build development, two sort of final questions I want to go through, is you've removed question 7 really. You've removed heritage assets and recreation areas from the limits to build development. And I also asked the question, is it consistent with the principles of that document? And sort of almost what it says on the tin, the limits to build development, using examples there as to where, say, recreation area isn't built development in that sense. Just a quick question. Do you think that's effective? So again, do you think the sort of person on the ground, member of the local community, is it clear that limits to built development might exclude when you've got churches and play areas and things like that? Would they not see that as part of the village or town area?
It's more where it's open aspect on the edge, and it's to do with setting really, and how it's viewed in the wider context. So if you've got heritage asset in open grounds, and it's on the edge of the settlement, the open aspect might form an important feature or part of its character and setting. I can see what you're saying, but they're on the edge. So.
Just a general comment there. these are policy lines. They don't relate to the, they don't describe a settlement, they don't define the settlement. In fact, they often cut across the sort of loosely on the edge of settlements. They are purely a policy line for development management purposes. And you have to say, I think there is a real need for them to be fairly definitive as well, because you need that clarity from the development management stage backwards to actually acquiring the land. So we outside of the strategic sites, we do think that they should be taken as they are. And I take the point that within the site, which was a different issue, which I think we'll come on to when we get to what's been done about the disposition of uses, is a slightly different issue. In terms of the boundaries themselves, I think they do need to be clearly sort of expressed in the local plan, as they are generally in local plans, to say, as definitive boundaries. And then there are clearly, as Bradley says, on the edge of the settlements, that there are parks and gardens, open spaces that contribute to the setting of development and the seen in that context, but still as part of the village.
There's two settlements that don't have settlement boundaries that you referred to. What was the justification, this is question 8, what was the justification for not having limited development or settlement boundaries for those settlements? And you referred to the settlement role and function study, and it's obviously you said that Ivy Green and Kildown, a very low level of services and facilities, such that they do not constitute sustainable settlements. But was there, what was the cut-off point there? So was it, if you scored, settlement scored past a certain point that they weren't considered for inclusion? Why these two settlements?
We're looking at the criteria in the LBD topic paper itself, 3.82. What we've done in looking at all of the settlements is, or the LBD boundaries, is consistently applied the principles and the criteria that are set out in the LBD topic paper. So we've got the principles on page 10 and the criteria on 11 and 12. And a particular note in this case is criterion G, which says for inclusion in the LBD boundary, settlements should allow reasonable access to local facilities and services. That was a key factor, the sustainability aspect. So obviously the role and function study scored in that regard. And as we've already said, Kildown and Iden Green were low scorers and considered not to be sustainable.
Was there a particular reason why, again, just looking at it, the score says 16, but then fitting the score's 19, but does have a settlement boundary. So again, was there, was there a cut-off point, or was there a particular type of service or facility that the settlement had to have?
And really we were focusing on key facilities, key services like a post office and a shop and the bus services. And as we say at paragraph 47 of our response, in terms of, sorry, just let me have a look. We say both have very limited bus services, so there's one bus journey a week for Iden Green, 2 bus journeys a week for Kildown, whereas looking at other settlements in the role and function study, they have better services in terms of transport and key facilities such as a shop or post office.
Just finally from me then, where you've got a development proposal that comes forward in a location outside the settlement boundary, is the plan clear as to how a developer or decision maker will react there? So, say for example, in one of these settlements, a site comes forward for residential development, what policy would apply? Is there sort of an overarching strategic policy that says, we're supporting development within limits to development, but outside, presumably the countryside policy applies? Which policy is that?
It's STR1.
Okay. That's set out in our response to question 9.
STR1.
Part 2 of the policy and paragraph, in fact, the preceding paragraph before the policy 4.49 highlights it as well.
So criteria criteria 9, the key criteria for LBD.
Do you think STR1 is clear enough to be effective? It says things like looks to focus new developments in limits to development, normally limits development countryside. Do you think it's clear enough to be effective?
I can guess where thoughts are going. We can consider making some changes which take away any potential ambiguity in interpretation. So, sure.
I think for development management purposes, if was the STR1 issue to go to maybe done this work out limits to development, set them out, say this is where we're supporting development. And I know that actually here you've probably got a lot of instances where you'd be in green belt or you'd be within AFB, which are anyway, but for areas where you haven't, I think it's just clearer as to where a decision maker goes with that application.
So in essence, what we're saying 4.49 I think in essence is a policy statement.
Yeah, and we'll come on to talk about as we go through your sort of countryside policies and how they apply. So there might be some sort of cross-reference in there. But I think as it's submitted, again, just picking up and looking at it for the first time, thinking, right, okay, minimum limits to build development. Is the plan positively prepared, clear and effective that that's good, development's acceptable, that's what we want to be, and if not, where next? So just making that call. We talked about the little fringe sites, haven't we? We talked about those and the other site that's supposed to remove from the green belt. You should be thinking about that one ahead of the employment session.
It's just picking up on the point you made in relation to STR1 and 9. And when you talk about, or the council talking about limits to built development and what is then appropriate in the countryside or not, you might refer to recreational uses as appropriate in the countryside. That would fall with the MPF quite straightforwardly. But if you're talking about open space associated with, for example, a residential development, I'm not quite sure that legally fits into that sort of requirement. And therefore, I think there just needs to be careful consideration as to what is defined, as we were talking about earlier, what's allocated site, and then what is within a built development within boundary, because they are all associated and then the ancillary to what's actually being constructed at that site. It wouldn't necessarily fall within the normal definition of recreational uses in the countryside, because there would be a linkage to what's happening. Thank you.
How, under your allocation proposal then, where you've got these limited development, you've got sort of residential areas, which are shown as the sort of orange areas, and then you've got the green areas next to it, which is open space. Is that the intention that they would be open space in terms of just open, left open, buffers, landscaping, or would they be used as play areas associated with development?
In essence, the one on the south side, and I'm sure I haven't seen the proposal that is being referred to, but in essence, I would imagine that would certainly be, because it is about providing a substantial tree screen on that southern boundary, that it would for the most part be a tree belt. But open areas could go into that because it is a variable boundary, I'm sure.
I think there's probably enough flexibility within to address very specific sites on an individual basis. Anyone else? Okay, we'll take a very quick jump to just got one more issue to go through. We'll not take very long forward, I don't think, but just 5 minutes of the break, is that okay? Yeah,
No, I was looking forward.
Yes, excellent. Okay, that's continuing the last couple of questions for the day, really. It's a development management point, really, but it sort of fits with some of the wider issues, hence why it's tagged on to the end of today. Question one: villages in the Greenbelt, and I think this goes back to right to the start of the day, really. We talked about the second hierarchy, we talked about the change of the plan to reflect those discussions. This question from South really: does the plan set out anywhere villages in the Greenbelt? I'm talking here about the application of Greenbelt policy, so where you've got limited infilling villages, essentially. Does the plan set out those villages?
In terms of the ones that are washed over?
Yeah.
It doesn't actually identify them anywhere particular, I can recall. There is no change between this plan and the existing plan. The inset maps do show clearly which settlements are washed over or inset very clearly. And in each of the sections of the plan that talks about the settlement, it explains the situation in relation to the Greenbelt within that.
So you sometimes get to that debate, don't you, with limited infilling a village, what is a village? And then some plans will set out, these are our Greenbelt villages, which removes that ambiguity. So it's more of a question, really. Is that an issue which is faced the council with?
It's not something anybody has commented on, as far as I'm aware, in terms of this policy or our approach to Greenbelt at all in any of the discussions we've had. So yes, I'm not aware it's been a problem or something we've had to address.
So do you just consider that on a case by case judgment about what a village is and isn't?
Yeah.
In terms of certain kind of questions.
Yes.
It's one of those where is the plan and the sound by not do that? Probably not. Where development or new development is proposed in the Greenbelt. Again, question 2 is really just to pick up some quite minor development management points, really. Is policy STR9 sort of go-to policy then for determining plan applications in the Greenbelts?
It is, and again, I believe we had barely 1 or 2 comments on the Greenbelt policy as it was developed. Mostly, some people saying we didn't need one at all, and some grateful that it was there.
Is that the only policy then? There's not others the only ones. It's just STR9.
Just for Greenbelt, yes. There is no separate DM policy.
Just have a look at the wording. This falls into the tricky situation about not copying national planning policy, but equally in not copying it, you don't want to get it wrong. Have a look at the wording. Things like you need to outweigh the harm, NPPF proposed to clearly outweigh. So it's those quite minute points. I don't mean sort of nitpick over things, but we've all been there where it comes down to wording and individual words. So have a look at STR9, and if you are going to go down that way, just double check the wording is actually consistent with the framework.
So it's a very minor point, but obviously the premise of STR9, the second paragraph, we obviously disagree with, but you've got the point. I mean, this is all on the premise that you accept exceptional circumstances. I just want to make that clear to make that clear, and I think for some of the supporters of Safe Cable to understand what we've said, but obviously it's all on the premise that you would agree that there are exceptional circumstances. But that's
just essentially looking at the third paragraph. What do you do with really?
So I was just going to make the point. So I think the reason why there isn't a separate DM policy is, in essence, that the MPPF and the DPG covers it comprehensively, but we do have policies which refer to greenbelt. Some of the DM policies do pick up on greenbelt, and they will be indeed in certain respects. So just to highlight that.
Yeah, so just have a look at the third paragraph in particular, just make sure that the word is where it is based on the NPPF is consistent. But yeah, tricky one falls into that category of you don't want to copy it, you want to copy it wrong. Presumably they'll all be changed by national DM policies. Sure, good. Anybody, any other points, observations, want to raise? Good opportunity to say anything today. Okay, excellent. So tomorrow morning, back in this room, it's another 9:30 start, and we're going to obviously starting to again look at the principle of greenbelt release. Again, tomorrow, as has been for the entirety of this week, it's around the principle, the methodology, those sort of issues. Again, we'll probably cross-reference with sites, but we won't get drawn into the detail of individual allocations, so we've got set days and times for those. Unless there's any other questions? No? No? Okay, thank you all for your time. We'll adjourn today.